Jackpot! My husband's mistress laughed in the ICU. Let's save the money for Paris. He agreed and left me. He didn't know my millionaire stepson had cameras in the room. My stepson paid for my surgery. A week later, as they toasted in Paris, 3 black SUVs surrounded them. My stepson stepped out and said, "Enjoy your last champagne. You are going to prison." I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Marcy and I'm 64 years old. 20 years ago, I thought I'd found my happily ever after when I married Quincy. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I never imagined just how wrong until I woke up in the ICU at St. Mary's Hospital, fighting for my life while my husband planned my funeral. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in November. I remember the exact moment because I was looking at our kitchen clock when my foot missed the bottom step of our staircase. The fall felt endless, my body tumbling down the wooden stairs like a rag doll. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Quincy standing at the top of the stairs, not rushing to help me, just watching. When I finally regained consciousness, the world felt distant and muffled. The rhythmic beeping of monitors filled my ears, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the ICU made my eyes water. My entire body ached in ways I'd never experienced, and breathing felt like trying to suck air through a straw. The nurses told me later that I'd suffered a severe head injury, 3 broken ribs, and internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what I heard next. I was drifting in and out of consciousness when I heard Quincy's voice in the hallway outside my room. He wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, someone I didn't recognize, and their conversation made my blood run cold even through the fog of pain medication. "So how long do you think she has?" the woman asked. Her voice was young, maybe late 20s, with a slight southern accent that sounded almost sweet until you heard what she was saying. Quincy's response was casual, like they were discussing the weather. "The doctors say it could go either way. Honestly, Sarah, at her age and with these injuries, it might be a blessing if she doesn't make it." Sarah. I'd never heard that name before, but the way she spoke to my husband suggested they knew each other very well. Too well. "Poor thing," Sarah continued, but there wasn't an ounce of sympathy in her voice. "Still, it's probably for the best. I mean, what kind of life would she have anyway? And think about the medical bills. Those life support machines must cost a fortune." I wanted to scream, to sit up and demand to know who this woman was and why she was talking about me like I was already dead. But my body wouldn't cooperate. The medications kept me trapped in a state between sleep and waking, able to hear everything but powerless to respond. Quincy sighed heavily, and I could picture him running his hand through his graying hair the way he always did when he was thinking. "You're right. The insurance will cover some of it, but not everything. And frankly, I don't see the point in bankrupting myself for someone who's already lived her life." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like another fall down the stairs. This was my husband of 20 years, the man who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health, talking about my potential death like it was a minor inconvenience. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that I had to strain to hear. "About afterwards, I mean." "You mean about us?" Quincy's voice had a warmth in it that I hadn't heard in years. "Of course I have. Once this is all over, we can finally be together properly. No more sneaking around, no more pretending. My heart monitor must have registered my distress because a nurse came in to check on me. I heard their conversation pause, and then Quincy was suddenly at my bedside, playing the role of the concerned husband. "Any change?" he asked the nurse, his voice filled with fake worry. "Her vitals are stable," the young nurse replied kindly. "She's been stirring a bit more, which is a good sign. Brain injury patients often take time to fully wake up." "I see," Quincy said, and I could hear the disappointment he was trying to hide. "Well, I'll be back tomorrow. Sarah here is a nurse too, She's been helping me understand the medical situation. The nurse made polite conversation with Sarah about her nursing background while I lay there, pretending to be unconscious and trying to process what I'd just learned. My husband was having an affair with a woman young enough to be his daughter, and they were both hoping I would die so they could be together without the messy complications of divorce. After they left, I spent hours staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the dots in the acoustic panels and trying to make sense of my life. How had I been so blind? Looking back, there had been signs. The late nights at work that became more frequent. The way he'd become distant and irritable whenever I tried to show him affection. The mysterious charges on our credit card that he explained away as business expenses. But I'd attributed all of it to normal marital issues, the kind of problems that couples in their 60s work through together. I never imagined he was planning a future that didn't include me. The next day brought more revelations. Quincy returned around noon, again with Sarah in tow. This time, they were more careful about where they had their conversation, but the medications had begun to clear my system, and my hearing had become sharper. "The lawyer says we need to be patient," Quincy was telling her as they stood near the window. "If she recovers, we'll have to go with Plan B." "And what exactly is Plan B?" Sarah asked. "Divorce, obviously. It'll be messy and expensive, but it's better than nothing." Sarah made a small humming sound, like she was considering this option. "But if she doesn't recover, everything goes to you automatically, right? As her husband?" "That's right. The house, her savings, her life insurance, all of it." "How much life insurance?" $150,000. Plus she has about $47,000 in her personal savings account, and the house is worth at least $380,000. I felt sick listening to them calculate my worth like I was a piece of property they were appraising. These weren't the musings of grieving relatives trying to handle practical matters. This was cold, calculated planning by people who saw my potential death as a financial opportunity. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "maybe we shouldn't be so quick to hope for a recovery. I mean, the medical bills alone could eat up a significant portion of that money." Quincy was quiet for a moment. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm just saying that sometimes when someone has been through this kind of trauma, complications can arise. Infections, blood clots, that sort of thing. Natural complications that no one could have prevented." The implication in her words made my skin crawl. Sarah wasn't just hoping for my death. She was suggesting they might help it along. And Quincy wasn't immediately shutting down the idea. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice cautious, "we need to be very careful here. The last thing we want is to raise suspicions." "Of course," she agreed quickly. "I'm just thinking out loud. But you know I have access to this floor. I could keep an eye on things, make sure she's getting the best possible care." The way she emphasized best possible care made it clear she meant the opposite. As they continued their conversation, planning my demise with the casual efficiency of people discussing weekend plans, I made a decision. If I survived this, I was going to make sure they paid for what they were doing. I didn't know how yet, but I would find a way. What they didn't know was that I had someone in my corner, someone they'd completely forgotten about in their calculations. My stepson Donovan had been traveling for business when my accident happened, but he was due back any day. Donovan was 40 years old, successful, and more importantly, he actually cared about me. When Quincy and I got married 20 years ago, Donovan was just 20, angry about his father's new relationship and resentful of my presence in their lives. But over the years, we'd built a real relationship. I'd been there for him during his difficult college years, his early career struggles, and his divorce 3 years ago. Unlike his father, Donovan had grown into a man of integrity and loyalty. If anyone would see through Quincy's act, it would be him. I just had to stay alive long enough for him to get here. That evening, alone in my room with only the steady beeping of monitors for company, I heard Quincy on his cell phone in the hallway. He was talking to someone about canceling our upcoming anniversary cruise, telling them that his wife was in the hospital and might not make it. "Yes," It's very tragic, he was saying, but his tone suggested he found it anything but tragic. We were so looking forward to that trip to Paris we had planned for next month. Sarah and I were going to celebrate well, it would have been our unofficial honeymoon, if you know what I mean. Paris. They'd been planning to use our anniversary money to take their romantic getaway. The cruise we'd booked months ago, the one I'd been so excited about, was never meant for us at all. It was meant for Quincy and his mistress. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to my husband plan his future with another woman while I fought for my life, I felt something shift inside me. The love I'd carried for 20 years, the loyalty that had blinded me to his true nature, began to calcify into something harder and colder. They thought I was helpless, lying here unconscious and dying. They thought they could plan their crimes right outside my door without consequence. But they were wrong about that too. I was very much awake, and I was listening to every word. The third day in the ICU brought a clarity I hadn't experienced since the accident. The pain medications were being reduced, and my mind felt sharper, more alert to every sound and conversation around me. I'd learned to control my breathing and heart rate, keeping my body perfectly still whenever Quincy and Sarah entered my room. As far as they knew, I was still unconscious, hovering between life and death. That morning, they arrived earlier than usual, around 9 o'clock. Sarah was carrying a small leather portfolio, and she seemed more businesslike than before. She was an attractive woman, I had to admit, with auburn hair and the kind of figure that comes from regular gym sessions. Everything about her screamed youthful vitality, the complete opposite of a 64-year-old woman lying broken in a hospital bed. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Sarah said as she set her portfolio on the small table beside my bed. "And I think we might be approaching this all wrong." Quincy moved closer to the window, checking to make sure the door was closed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, why should we leave anything to chance? Why should we sit here hoping for natural complications when we could be more proactive?" My blood chilled at her words, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still, keeping my breathing steady and my eyes closed. "Sarah," Quincy said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that accidents happen in hospitals all the time," she replied calmly. "Medication errors, equipment malfunctions, sudden deteriorations. With my access to this floor and my medical knowledge, it would be very easy to ensure that Marcy doesn't suffer unnecessarily." The casual way she discussed murdering me while standing 3 feet from my bed was so surreal that for a moment I wondered if I was having a nightmare induced by the pain medications. But the steady beep of my heart monitor and the antiseptic smell of the hospital room confirmed that this was horribly, frighteningly real. Quincy was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had a quality I'd never heard before, cold and calculating. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah opened her portfolio and pulled out what sounded like medical charts. "I've been reviewing her case with Dr. Martinez. She's stable now, but her condition is still considered critical. A sudden infection, a problem with her medication, even something as simple as a dislodged breathing tube could cause complications that would be very difficult to reverse. And you could make that happen? I could ensure that if such complications arose, they wouldn't be caught in time to prevent them from becoming fatal." I had to concentrate every ounce of my willpower to keep from reacting. This woman, this nurse who was supposed to heal and protect patients, was calmly planning my murder. And my husband, the man I'd loved and trusted for 20 years, was listening with interest rather than horror. "How would we explain your presence on this floor?" Quincy asked. "I mean, if there are questions later?" "That's the beauty of it," Sarah said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm already here as your emotional support. I'm a nurse, and you're a distraught husband who needs professional guidance to understand his wife's condition. No one would question my involvement." "And afterwards?" "Afterwards, we grieve appropriately. You play the devastated widower, I'm the compassionate nurse who helped you through the worst time of your life. After a respectable period, we develop a relationship based on shared trauma and understanding. She had it all planned out, down to the fictional love story they'd tell people about how they met. I wondered how many times she'd done this before, how many other wives had died under mysterious circumstances while their husbands found comfort with the helpful nurse Sarah. Quincy moved away from the window and came to stand beside my bed. I could feel his presence, could smell the cologne I'd bought him last Christmas. You really think this could work? I know it could work, Sarah replied confidently. But we need to move quickly. The longer she stays stable, the more likely she is to recover. And recovery would complicate everything. When? The single word was barely audible, but it hit me like a physical blow. Tonight. The night shift has fewer people, less supervision. I can arrange to be here checking on her progress, and if something unfortunate happens during my visit, well, these things occur. Sometimes patients just take a turn for the worse. They stood there in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. I could hear the sounds of the hospital around us, the distant conversations of nurses, the rolling wheels of gurneys, the normal sounds of a place where people came to heal. It seemed impossible that in the middle of all this healing, two people were planning a murder. There's something else we need to discuss, Sarah said finally. The practical arrangements afterwards. What do you mean? I mean the money, Quincy, the insurance, the house, all of it. We need to have a plan for how we're going to handle the finances once she's gone. I heard the rustling of papers, and Sarah continued. I've done some research on the legalities. As her husband, you'll inherit everything automatically unless she has a will that states otherwise. Does she? No, Quincy said. We talked about making wills years ago, but we never got around to it. Everything we own is jointly held anyway. Perfect. That means the house, the savings, the insurance money, it all comes to you immediately. How much did you say the total was worth? The house is worth about $380,000, her savings account has $47,000, and the life insurance is $150,000. There's also my retirement account and some investments, probably another $100,000 total. Sarah whistled softly. That's nearly $700,000. Not bad for a night's work. The callous way she calculated the value of my life made me want to vomit. To them, I wasn't a person with feelings, memories, dreams, and fears. I was simply a financial obstacle standing between them and a comfortable future. We should start making plans for afterwards, Sarah continued. Where we'll live, how we'll handle the money. I think we should sell the house immediately and buy something new, somewhere we can start fresh without any memories of Marcy. Quincy's voice took on a dreamy quality. I've always wanted to live in Paris. With this kind of money, we could buy a nice apartment there, maybe near the Seine. Paris, Sarah repeated, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. I love it. We could be there by Christmas, starting our new life together. They began to discuss their future plans with the enthusiasm of newlyweds planning their dream home, completely oblivious to the fact that their dream was built on my grave. They talked about cafes and museums, about learning French together, about the romantic apartment they'd rent while they looked for the perfect place to buy. You know what we should do? Sarah said suddenly. We should book that trip to Paris right now, for next month. It'll give us something to look forward to, and it'll help sell the story that you need to get away after the tragedy. That's brilliant, Quincy agreed. A grieving widower taking a trip to heal and process his loss with the compassionate nurse who helped him through the darkest time of his life. I heard Sarah typing on what must have been her phone. I'm looking at flights now. There's a beautiful boutique hotel in the Marais district that would be perfect. Very romantic, very private. Book it, Quincy said without hesitation. Book it for 3 weeks from now. By then, everything will be settled, and we can start our real life together. As they made their travel arrangements, discussing restaurants they wanted to try and sights they wanted to see, I felt a strange sense of detachment from my own body. It was as if I was floating above the scene, watching these two people plan their future while the woman they intended to murder lay helpless beside them. But I wasn't helpless. Not entirely. My mind was working, planning, calculating just like theirs. I knew that Donovan was supposed to return from his business trip tomorrow. I knew that he would come straight to the hospital when he landed. And I knew that unlike his father, Donovan would see through any performance Quincy and Sarah might put on. I just had to survive the next 24 hours. I should go, Sarah said finally. I need to review the medical protocols for tonight and make sure everything is in place. When will I see you again? Quincy asked, and there was an intimacy in his voice that made my stomach turn. Tonight, around midnight. I'll be here for her final checkup. Final checkup. The euphemism was so casual, so professional sounding, that it took a moment for the full weight of it to hit me. They were planning to kill me in just a few hours. After they left, I lay in the growing darkness of my hospital room, listening to the sounds of the evening shift taking over. Nurses chatted quietly in the hallway. Doctors made their rounds, and somewhere in the distance, a television played the evening news. I thought about my life, about the 20 years I'd spent with Quincy, about all the small moments and shared experiences that I'd believed were building towards something lasting. Our wedding day, when he'd cried as I walked down the aisle. The way he used to bring me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. The trips we'd taken together, the friends we'd made, the life we'd built. Had any of it been real? Or had I been living in a fantasy while he planned my eventual demise? But then I thought about Donovan, about the relationship we'd built over the years, about how he'd grown from a resentful teenager into a man I was genuinely proud of. He would be here tomorrow, and when he arrived, everything would change. I just had to make sure I was still alive when he got here. I'd been staring at the ceiling tiles for what felt like an eternity, counting the small holes in the acoustic panels and trying to keep my mind focused on anything except the fact that Sarah would return at midnight to end my life. The clock on the wall showed 11:37 when I heard footsteps in the hallway that I recognized immediately. Donovan. He was back earlier than expected, and the familiar sound of his confident stride filled me with a relief so profound that I had to fight back tears. Even through my closed eyelids, I could sense when he entered the room, bringing with him the faint scent of expensive cologne and the energy of someone who'd just stepped off a long flight. Jesus Christ, he whispered, and I could hear the genuine distress in his voice as he took in my condition. What the hell happened to you, Marcy? I wanted so desperately to open my eyes, to tell him everything I'd overheard, to warn him about what was coming. But I knew that Quincy could return at any moment, and I needed Donovan to see the truth for himself without any interference from me. He pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down heavily. I could feel his presence beside me, solid and reassuring in a way that Quincy's had never been. Even before I learned the truth about him, I got Dad's message about the accident, Donovan said quietly, apparently talking to my unconscious form. But he made it sound like you just took a tumble down the stairs. This looks like so much more than that. He was right, of course. The extent of my injuries suggested a much more serious fall than the simple slip Quincy had described to people. But Donovan had always been observant, always willing to ask the hard questions that others avoided. I heard him pull out his phone and dial a number. Dr. Martinez, this is Donovan Richards, Marcy's stepson. I just arrived and I'd like to discuss her condition. Yes, I know it's late, but I flew in from Singapore as soon as I heard. Thank you. While he waited for the doctor, Donovan began moving around my room, and I could hear him examining things with the methodical precision that had made him successful in business. He was looking at my chart, checking the monitors, asking questions that a casual visitor wouldn't think to ask. Dr. Martinez arrived 15 minutes later, a kind man in his 50s who'd been treating me since the accident. I'd heard his voice several times over the past few days, always professional but genuinely caring. Mr. Richards, the doctor said as he entered the room. "I'm glad you're here. Your stepmother's injuries are quite serious." "Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Donovan asked. "My father said she fell down the stairs, but looking at her injuries, this seems like more than a simple fall." I could hear Dr. Martinez flipping through pages of my chart. "The pattern of injuries is consistent with a fall down a full flight of stairs. She has a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding that required emergency surgery, and significant bruising. What's unusual is the nature of some of the trauma." "Unusual how?" "Well, typically in a fall like this, we see injuries concentrated on one side of the body, the side that hits the stairs. But Marcy has impact injuries on multiple sides, suggesting she may have bounced or tumbled quite extensively." "Or was pushed," Donovan said quietly. The doctor paused. "I'm not qualified to make that determination, but I will say that the injury pattern raised some questions for me as well." They talked for several more minutes about my condition, my prognosis, and the treatment plan. Dr. Martinez was cautiously optimistic that I would recover fully, given time and proper care. But he also mentioned that patients in my condition were vulnerable to complications, especially infections or medication errors. After the doctor left, Donovan returned to his chair beside my bed. I could sense that he was thinking, processing what he'd learned, and probably beginning to form the same suspicions that would have occurred to any intelligent person looking at the situation objectively. "Marcy," he said softly, "I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, I want you to know that something doesn't feel right about this whole situation. Dad's been acting strange, evasive when I ask questions about what happened. And there's something else." He paused, and I heard him moving around again, this time near the window. "I had security cameras installed at the house last month," he continued. "Dad doesn't know about them. I was worried about break-ins in the neighborhood, and I thought it would be good to have some protection for you both while I was traveling." Security cameras. My heart rate spiked with excitement, but I forced myself to remain still. If Donovan had cameras at the house, they might have recorded what really happened when I fell down the stairs. "I'm going to review the footage tomorrow," he said. "I need to see exactly what happened that morning." At that moment, I heard voices in the hallway. Quincy was returning, and he wasn't alone. Sarah was with him, probably arriving for her midnight shift and my planned murder. "Donovan?" Quincy's voice carried a note of surprise as he entered the room. "I thought you weren't getting back until tomorrow." "I caught an earlier flight," Donovan replied, and I could hear the coolness in his tone. "I wanted to be here." Of course," Quincy said, but he sounded nervous. "Any change in her condition?" "Dr. Martinez says she's stable but still critical. He mentioned that patients in her condition are vulnerable to complications." "Yes, well, that's why we have such excellent medical staff taking care of her," Quincy said. "This is Sarah, by the way. She's a nurse here, and she's been helping me understand Marcy's condition." I could feel the tension in the room ratchet up several degrees. Here was Sarah, prepared to commit murder, suddenly faced with an unexpected witness. And here was Donovan, already suspicious about my accident, now meeting the woman who planned to kill me. "Sarah?" Donovan said politely, but I could hear the assessment in his voice. "How long have you been caring for Marcy?" "Oh, I'm not directly assigned to her case," Sarah replied smoothly. "I work on this floor, and I've been helping your father understand the medical terminology and procedures. It can be very overwhelming for family members." "I'm sure it can be," Donovan agreed. "It's fortunate that Dad has found such dedicated support during this difficult time." There was something in the way he said it that made me think he was already picking up on the dynamics between Quincy and Sarah. Donovan had always been good at reading people, at sensing when things weren't quite what they seemed. "Well," Sarah said after an awkward pause, "I should check on my other patients. Mr. Richards, it was nice meeting you." "Likewise," Donovan replied. "I'm sure I'll see you around during visiting hours." After Sarah left, Quincy attempted to make small talk with his son, but the conversation felt forced and artificial. Donovan asked pointed questions about the morning of my accident, about what Quincy had seen, about whether I'd seemed unsteady or dizzy in the days leading up to the fall. Quincy's answers were vague and inconsistent, and I could tell that Donovan was filing away every contradiction for later analysis. "I think I'm going to stay here tonight," Donovan announced around midnight. "I want to be close by in case there's any change in her condition." "That's really not necessary," Quincy said quickly. "The hospital staff is excellent, and there's nothing you can do here that they can't do better." "I know, but I'd feel better staying. You look exhausted, Dad. Why don't you go home and get some proper sleep? I'll call you if anything changes." I could practically feel Quincy's panic. If Donovan stayed, Sarah wouldn't be able to carry out her plan, but he couldn't argue too strongly without seeming suspicious. "Are you sure?" Quincy asked weakly. "Positive. I'll take good care of her." After Quincy reluctantly left, Donovan settled into the chair beside my bed for what he clearly intended to be a long night's vigil. Around 12:30, I heard him on the phone, speaking in low tones to someone about increasing security at the house and reviewing camera footage as soon as possible. Around 1 in the morning, Sarah appeared in my doorway. I could sense her hesitation when she saw Donovan sitting alertly beside my bed. "Oh," she said. "I didn't realize anyone was still here." "I decided to stay the night," Donovan replied pleasantly. "Is there something you need to check on with Marcy?" "I was just doing my rounds, making sure all the patients on this floor are comfortable." "That's very dedicated of you. I appreciate the attention you're giving to her care." Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment longer, probably trying to figure out if there was any way to proceed with her plan. But with Donovan wide awake and watchful, she had no choice but to continue her rounds and leave me alone. "Have a good night," she said finally, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. "You too," Donovan replied. "Thank you for everything you're doing." After she left, Donovan leaned closer to my bed. "I don't know what game they're playing," he said quietly, "but I'm not leaving you alone with them. Something is very wrong here, and I'm going to figure out what it is." He spent the rest of the night in that chair, and I spent it feeling safer than I had since the moment I woke up in this hospital bed. Donovan might not know the full extent of the conspiracy yet, but his instincts were telling him the same things mine were. Quincy couldn't be trusted, Sarah was dangerous, and I needed protection. When the sun began to rise through the hospital windows, I knew I had survived the night. Sarah's plan had been thwarted by Donovan's unexpected presence, which meant I would live to see another day. But more importantly, I now had an ally, someone who was asking the right questions and looking for the truth. The next phase of this nightmare was about to begin, but for the first time since my accident, I felt like I might actually have a chance to survive it. And maybe, just maybe, to get justice for what they'd tried to do to me. The morning brought a new energy to my hospital room. Donovan had stayed true to his word, spending the entire night in the chair beside my bed, and I could see the determination in his posture even with my eyes closed. Around 7 in the morning, I heard him making phone calls, coordinating with his security team, and making arrangements that I couldn't quite follow, but that filled me with hope. Dr. Martinez made his morning rounds around 8, checking my vitals and discussing my progress with Donovan. The doctor seemed pleased with my stability overnight, mentioning that my brain activity had been more consistent and that my chances of a full recovery were improving. "When might she wake up?" Donovan asked. "It's hard to say with head injuries," Dr. Martinez replied. "Could be today, could be several more days, but her signs are encouraging. The swelling in her brain has decreased significantly." After the doctor left, Donovan received a phone call that changed everything. "Marcus, thank you for getting back to me so quickly," he said, and I realized he was talking to the head of his security company. "Did you have a chance to review the footage from Tuesday morning?" There was a long pause as Donovan listened to whatever Marcus was telling him. I could hear his breathing change, becoming sharper and more focused. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked. The footage is clear enough to see exactly what happened? Another pause, longer this time. Jesus, Donovan whispered. Send me the file immediately. And Marcus, I want you to make copies and store them in multiple locations. This is evidence in what might become a criminal case. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid the monitors would give me away. The security cameras had captured something, and from Donovan's reaction, it wasn't the accidental fall that Quincy had described to everyone. One more thing, Donovan continued. I want comprehensive background checks on Sarah Chen. She's a nurse here at the hospital. I want to know everything about her employment history, her personal life, any connections she might have to similar cases, and I want it today. Sarah Chen. Now I had a full name for the woman who'd planned my murder. After he ended the call, Donovan pulled out his laptop and spent the next hour reviewing something that clearly disturbed him deeply. I could hear him occasionally muttering under his breath, words like unbelievable and bastard, that told me he was seeing exactly what I suspected he'd see. Around 10 in the morning, Quincy arrived with coffee and pastries, playing the role of the devoted husband bringing breakfast for his son's bedside vigil. Any change overnight? Quincy asked, and I could hear the hope in his voice that there had been a change for the worse. She's been very stable, Donovan replied, his voice carefully neutral. Dr. Martinez thinks her chances of recovery are actually quite good. Oh, Quincy said, and he couldn't quite hide his disappointment. Well, that's wonderful news. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. I could feel the tension in the room increase dramatically. Quincy must have sensed that something had changed overnight. Of course, Quincy said, but his voice was wary. Tell me again exactly what happened Tuesday morning when Marcy fell. I've already told you. She was going downstairs to make coffee, and she missed a step. I heard the noise and came running, but it was too late. You were upstairs when it happened? Yes, I was getting dressed in our bedroom. And where exactly was Marcy when she fell? Top of the stairs, middle, bottom? Quincy hesitated, and in that hesitation, I knew he was realizing that his story was about to be challenged. I'm not entirely sure. I heard the noise, but I didn't actually see her fall. That's interesting, Donovan said calmly, because the security cameras I installed last month show a very different version of events. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in the monitors. Security cameras? Quincy's voice was barely a whisper. Full coverage of the main floor, including the staircase. And what I see on that footage, Dad, is you following Marcy down the stairs, arguing with her about something, and then pushing her hard enough to send her tumbling down the entire flight. I heard Quincy's sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor as he presumably sat down heavily. The footage is crystal clear, Donovan continued, his voice growing colder. I can see Marcy trying to get away from you. I can see you grabbing her arm, and I can see you shoving her down those stairs with enough force to cause exactly the injuries she sustained. Donovan, you don't understand, Quincy started, but his son cut him off. Oh, I understand perfectly. What I don't understand is why. Why would you try to kill the woman who's been nothing but good to you for 20 years? The accusation hung in the air between them. I wanted to applaud Donovan for his directness, for refusing to let his father make excuses or deflect blame. It's not what it looks like, Quincy said weakly. Really? Because what it looks like is attempted murder. And what it feels like is that I need to call the police right now. Wait, Quincy said urgently. Please, just wait. Let me explain. Explain what? How you plan to inherit Marcy's money? How you've been having an affair with that nurse Sarah? How you stood outside this room discussing whether to let Marcy die from her injuries or speed the process along? My blood ran cold. How could Donovan possibly know about those conversations unless— You've been recording us, Quincy said, and his voice was filled with a mixture of horror and admiration. The room has audio surveillance, yes. I activated it the moment I arrived and realized something wasn't right. So I've heard every word of your conversations with Sarah, including your plans for tonight. Donovan had been recording everything. Every cruel word, every heartless plan, every casual discussion of my murder had been captured for posterity. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Quincy said, and for the first time, there was something desperate in his voice. Sarah isn't just some nurse I'm having an affair with. This is bigger than you think. Then explain it to me. Quincy was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the pretense of being a loving husband. What remained was something cold and calculating. Sarah specializes in this kind of arrangement, he said finally. Wealthy older women who need assistance in transitioning to their final rest. Marcy isn't the first, and she won't be the last. The casual way he described serial murder made my skin crawl. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was a business, a systematic targeting and killing of older women for their money. How many? Donovan asked, and I could hear the disgust in his voice. 5, maybe 6 over the past 3 years. Sarah has a system. She identifies targets, I cultivate relationships with them, and when the time is right, they have accidents or complications. And you split the money. It's a very lucrative partnership. The matter-of-fact way Quincy discussed multiple murders was so chilling that I had to focus all my energy on keeping my breathing steady. This man I'd lived with, shared a bed with, trusted with my life, was a serial killer. Why Marcy? Donovan asked. She loved you. She would have done anything for you. She was convenient, Quincy replied with a shrug I could hear in his voice. Available, trusting, and worth enough money to make it worthwhile. Plus, she had no family other than you, which simplified things. Except she did have me. Yes, that was an unexpected complication. We thought you'd be easier to convince that her death was natural, especially since you travel so much. Donovan was quiet for several minutes, and I could imagine him processing everything he'd learned. His father wasn't just an unfaithful husband, or even a man who'd made one terrible mistake. He was a predator who made a living targeting and killing vulnerable women. Here's what's going to happen, Donovan said finally, his voice calm but implacable. You're going to confess everything to the police. You're going to provide evidence about Sarah's involvement and information about the other victims, and you're going to do it today. And if I refuse? Then I release the security footage and the audio recordings to the police, the FBI, and every major news outlet in the country. Your choice is whether you cooperate and possibly get a plea deal, or spend the rest of your life in prison after a very public trial. You're my son, Quincy said, playing his last card. You stopped being my father the moment you decided to murder the only mother figure I've had since I was 20 years old. The finality in Donovan's voice was unmistakable. Whatever relationship had existed between father and son was over, destroyed by the revelation of Quincy's true nature. I need time to think, Quincy said. You have until noon, Donovan replied. After that, I make the calls myself. I heard Quincy's footsteps as he left the room, probably to find Sarah and figure out their next move. But they were trapped now, caught between the evidence Donovan had gathered and the impossible situation they'd created for themselves. After his father left, Donovan came to stand beside my bed. Marcy, he said softly, I know you probably can't hear me, but I want you to know that you're safe now. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. But I could hear him. I'd heard everything, and for the first time since my accident, I felt genuine hope that justice might actually be possible. The next few hours would determine whether Quincy and Sarah faced consequences for their crimes, or whether they would try one last desperate gambit to escape the trap that was closing around them. Either way, I was ready for whatever came next. Noon came and went without any word from Quincy. Donovan had given him an ultimatum, and the silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. I remained in my carefully maintained unconscious state, listening to every sound, every phone call, every footstep in the hallway outside my room. Around 2 in the afternoon, Dr. Martinez stopped by for his regular check. "Her brain activity is excellent," he told Donovan. "I'm actually quite optimistic that she'll regain consciousness soon, possibly within the next day or two." "That's wonderful news," Donovan replied, but I could hear the distraction in his voice. He was dealing with much larger concerns than my medical recovery. After the doctor left, Donovan made a series of phone calls that painted a picture of the trap he was setting for his father and Sarah. I listened as he coordinated with law enforcement, international agencies, and his own security team to ensure that when Quincy and Sarah tried to escape, they would find themselves walking directly into a carefully planned operation. "The flight to Paris leaves tonight at 11:45, he told someone on the phone. "I've confirmed they both have tickets. Yes, I want agents waiting at Charles de Gaulle, but let them get to their hotel first. I want them to think they've succeeded before we close the trap." The audacity of it was breathtaking, even after being confronted with evidence of their crimes, even knowing that Donovan had recordings of their conspiracy to murder me. Quincy and Sarah were still planning to go through with their romantic getaway to Paris. They apparently believed they could simply disappear into Europe and start their new life with my money. Around 4 o'clock, I heard familiar footsteps approaching my room. Quincy was returning, probably to give Donovan his decision about cooperating with authorities. "Well?" Donovan asked as his father entered the room. "I've thought about what you said," Quincy replied, his voice calm and measured. "And I've decided you're bluffing." "Excuse me? You're not going to turn in your own father? Family loyalty means something, even if you're angry with me right now. In a few days, when you've had time to process everything, you'll realize that we can work this out privately." The sheer arrogance of it was stunning. After confessing to multiple murders, after being caught red-handed planning my death, Quincy still believed he could manipulate his son into protecting him. "You're wrong," Donovan said quietly. "We'll see. In the meantime, I think it's best if I take some time away to let things cool down. Sarah and I are going to Paris for a few weeks. When I get back, we can discuss this like adults." "Paris," Donovan repeated. "The trip you booked with Marcy's money while planning her murder. The money will be mine soon enough anyway. She's 64 years old, Donovan. Even if she recovers from this accident, how many good years does she really have left?" The casual dismissal of my life, the cold calculation in his voice, made me want to scream. This was a man who had shared my bed for 20 years, who had promised to love and protect me, talking about me like I was already dead. "Dad," Donovan said, and his voice was filled with something that might have been pity. "You really don't understand what you're dealing with, do you?" "What I understand is that you're upset, and you're making threats you don't intend to keep. But I'm still your father, and when push comes to shove, blood is thicker than water." "You're right about one thing," Donovan replied. "Blood is thicker than water. But Marcy has been more of a parent to me than you ever were. She's the one who remembered my birthday, who attended my graduation, who was there when my marriage fell apart. You were always too busy with your own interests to care about mine." "That's not fair." "Fair?" Donovan's voice rose slightly. "You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that you targeted vulnerable women for murder? Is it fair that you've been planning to kill the woman who's shown me nothing but kindness and support? This is business, Donovan. It's not personal. Murder is always personal, Dad. And this particular murder became very personal the moment you decided to target my family." I heard the sound of Quincy's phone buzzing, probably a text from Sarah about their travel plans or their contingency arrangements. "I have to go," Quincy said. "Our flight leaves soon, and I still need to pack." "Have a wonderful trip," Donovan said, and there was something ominous in his tone that made me think Quincy should be very worried about what awaited him in Paris. After his father left, Donovan spent the next few hours coordinating the final details of what was clearly an international law enforcement operation. I heard him speaking with FBI agents, Interpol officers, and French authorities, all working together to ensure that Quincy and Sarah's romantic getaway became their downfall. "The hotel is under surveillance," he told someone around 8 o'clock. "They should arrive at approximately 2 in the afternoon local time tomorrow. I want them to have just enough time to get comfortable before we move in." Around midnight, my phone rang. Donovan answered it, though I hadn't realized until then that he'd been monitoring my personal calls. "Marcy's phone," he said. "Is this Donovan?" The voice was Sarah's, and she sounded nervous. "It is. Can I help you?" "I was just calling to check on Marcy's condition before I go off duty for a few days." "How thoughtful of you. She's stable, still unconscious, but the doctors are optimistic about her recovery." There was a pause. "That's wonderful news. Please let me know if there are any changes." "Oh, I will," Donovan said. "Have a safe trip, Sarah." After he hung up, I could hear him chuckling softly to himself. "Checking to make sure you're still unconscious before they leave the country?" he said to me. "They really have no idea what's waiting for them." The next 24 hours passed slowly. Donovan kept a constant vigil beside my bed, fielding updates from law enforcement agencies and monitoring the progress of Quincy and Sarah's journey to their destruction. I learned that they had indeed boarded their flight to Paris, that they had cleared customs without incident, and that they were currently settled into their romantic boutique hotel in the Marais district. "They're at dinner now," Donovan told me around what must have been early evening Paris time, at a little restaurant called Le Petit Coeur. Apparently they're celebrating their successful escape. I could picture them there, toasting their freedom with expensive champagne, probably laughing about how they'd fooled everyone and gotten away with murder. The image filled me with a cold anger that gave me strength. Around 10 o'clock that evening, Donovan's phone rang with the call we'd both been waiting for. "It's done," he said, after listening to the voice on the other end. "They were arrested at the restaurant, both of them, no resistance." I wanted to cheer, to sit up and celebrate, but I forced myself to remain still. This was just the beginning of their legal troubles, and I needed to be conscious and able to testify when the time came. "Tell me everything," Donovan said to whoever had called him. Over the next 30 minutes, I listened as he received a detailed account of Quincy and Sarah's arrest. They had been enjoying a romantic dinner, apparently toasting their successful escape and planning their new life together, when 3 black SUVs surrounded the restaurant. Donovan himself had flown to Paris to be present for the arrest, though I hadn't realized he'd left the hospital. He'd wanted to look them in the eye when they realized their freedom was an illusion. "You should have seen their faces," the voice on the phone was saying. When those agents walked into the restaurant and announced themselves, when Donovan stepped out of the lead vehicle, they knew immediately that their game was over. "What did Dad say?" Donovan asked. He tried to deny everything at first, claimed they were just tourists on vacation. But when we played the audio recordings of their conspiracy, when we showed them the video of him pushing Marcy down the stairs, he broke down completely. "And Sarah?" "She tried to run, actually. Made it about 10 feet before the French police tackled her. She's claiming now that she was coerced, that your father threatened her into helping him. But the evidence shows she was the mastermind behind the whole operation." As the conversation continued, I learned more details about the scope of Sarah's crimes. The background investigation Donovan had ordered revealed that she had worked at 7 different hospitals over the past 5 years, and at each location, there had been an unusual number of deaths among elderly patients under her care. The pattern was clear once investigators knew what to look for. "How many total victims?" Donovan asked. "We're still investigating, but we think at least 12 women over the past 5 years. Your stepmother was going to be number 13. 12 women. 12 wives, mothers, grandmothers whose lives had been cut short by these predators. I felt sick thinking about their families, about the grief and loss that Quincy and Sarah had caused in their pursuit of easy money. They're being held without bail pending extradition, the voice continued. The French authorities are cooperating fully, and they should be back in the U.S. within the week. And the evidence is solid? Airtight. We have the security footage of the assault on Marcy, the audio recordings of their conspiracy, financial records showing the pattern of inheritance fraud, and now testimony from Sarah's former colleagues who witnessed suspicious deaths. After Donovan ended the call, he came to stand beside my bed. "It's over, Marcy," he said softly. "They're never going to hurt you or anyone else ever again." For the first time since my accident, I felt truly safe. The monsters who had planned my death were in custody, facing justice for their crimes. But more importantly, I had discovered something I'd never expected to find: a son who truly loved me, who had risked everything to protect me, and who had proven that family isn't always about blood. It was time to wake up. I opened my eyes on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Quincy and Sarah had been arrested in Paris. The first thing I saw was Donovan sitting beside my bed, his laptop open, apparently working while keeping watch over me. When he noticed my movement, his face lit up with a relief so profound that it brought tears to my eyes. "Marcy," he said, immediately setting aside his computer and leaning forward. "Thank God. How do you feel?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I managed to say, my voice hoarse from days of silence, "but alive." "Very much alive," he confirmed, reaching over to press the call button for the nurse. "And safe." Dr. Martinez arrived within minutes, clearly pleased to find me awake and responsive. He ran through a series of tests, checking my reflexes, my memory, my cognitive function. Everything seemed to be working properly, though I was weak and still in considerable pain from my injuries. "Your recovery is remarkable," he told me after completing his examination. "Head injuries like yours can have unpredictable outcomes, but you seem to have avoided any serious cognitive damage." "When can I go home?" I asked, then immediately wondered where home would be. The house I'd shared with Quincy was no longer a safe haven, and I wasn't sure I could ever feel comfortable there again. "Let's take it one day at a time," Dr. Martinez replied. "You'll need physical therapy, and we want to monitor you for any complications. But if your progress continues like this, you could be discharged within the week." After he left, Donovan and I had our first real conversation since my accident. He filled in the details I'd missed while pretending to be unconscious, including the extent of the international investigation that had grown out of Sarah's arrest. "She kept records," he told me, his voice grim. "Detailed files on every victim, every method, every dollar stolen. The FBI thinks she saw herself as some kind of artist, perfecting her craft. The idea that my near murder had been treated as an art project by Sarah made my skin crawl. But it also meant that the families of her other victims would finally have answers, and hopefully some measure of justice." "What about the other cases?" I asked. 12 confirmed victims across 5 states. Sarah would get a job at a hospital, identify vulnerable patients, then either kill them herself or recruit accomplices like Dad to do the relationship side of things. She's looking at life in prison without parole." "And Quincy?" Donovan's expression darkened. "He's trying to negotiate a plea deal by providing information about Sarah's other accomplices. Apparently, she had a whole network of people working for her. But even if he cooperates fully, he's looking at multiple life sentences. I should have felt satisfaction at the news that my would-be killers were facing appropriate punishment. Instead, I mostly felt empty, like something inside me had been permanently damaged by the betrayal. "I keep thinking about the 20 years we were married," I said. "Were any of those moments real? Did he ever actually love me? Or was I just another mark from the beginning?" Donovan was quiet for a moment before answering. "I've been wondering the same thing. The FBI timeline suggests he met Sarah about 3 years ago, so at least the first 17 years of your marriage were probably genuine. But honestly, Marcy, does it matter? You loved him honestly, you were a good wife to him, and you have nothing to be ashamed of." I feel like such a fool. You're not a fool. You're a victim of very sophisticated predators who made targeting and manipulating people their profession. The fact that they fooled you doesn't say anything about your judgment. It says something about their skill at deception. Over the next few days, as I grew stronger and began to process everything that had happened, Donovan and I talked extensively about the future. He made it clear that I was welcome to stay with him for as long as I needed, either in his guest house or in a new place of my own that he would help me find. I've been thinking about selling the house anyway, I told him during one of our conversations. Too many memories, too much deception hidden in those walls. What would you want to do instead? I'd been considering this question since waking up. My brush with death had clarified certain things about what mattered to me and what didn't. I want to help other women like me, I said. Women who've been targeted by predators, who've been betrayed by people they trusted. The FBI said Sarah had dozens of potential victims she was researching. Those women need to be warned. They need to understand the signs to watch for. Donovan nodded approvingly. That's a wonderful idea. And you'd have credibility that other advocates might not. You survived what they're trying to protect other people from. Would you help me? I don't know anything about setting up organizations or getting funding. Of course I'll help. Whatever you need. The conversation marked a turning point for both of us. Instead of dwelling on what had been lost, we began planning for what could be built. I had survived an attempt on my life, but more importantly, I had discovered that I wasn't as alone in the world as I'd thought. 2 weeks after waking up, I was discharged from the hospital. Donovan picked me up in his car, and as we drove past the house I'd shared with Quincy, I didn't feel any sadness or nostalgia. It was just a building now, a place where a different person had lived a different life. Where are we going? I asked as he turned onto a tree-lined street I didn't recognize. I have something to show you, he said with a smile. He pulled into the driveway of a modest but charming cottage, painted yellow with white trim and surrounded by a garden that clearly received loving care. It's beautiful, I said. Whose is it? Yours if you want it, Donovan replied. I know you said you wanted your own place, and this one came on the market last week. It's fully accessible for your physical therapy, it's in a safe neighborhood, and it has a perfect home office for your advocacy work. I stared at the cottage, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. Donovan, I can't let you buy me a house. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do this because you're my family, and family takes care of each other. Family. The word had taken on new meaning for me over the past month. I'd learned that family wasn't necessarily the people you shared blood with, or even the people you married. Family was the people who showed up for you when things got difficult, who protected you when you couldn't protect yourself, who loved you not because they had to, but because they chose to. Besides, Donovan added with a grin, I have it on good authority that you're going to be quite wealthy once all the legal proceedings are finished. The insurance money from your marriage will revert to you since Quincy can't inherit as a convicted felon, plus there will likely be restitution from Sarah's other crimes. You'll be able to pay me back if it makes you feel better. We walked through the cottage together, and I could immediately picture myself living there. There was a sun-filled living room with built-in bookshelves, a kitchen with windows overlooking the garden, and a small study that would be perfect for the advocacy work I was planning. The current owners are an elderly couple moving to assisted living, Donovan explained as we toured the rooms. They said they'd be honored to sell to someone who would appreciate the care they've put into the place. In the master bedroom, there was a photograph on the nightstand showing the elderly couple on their wedding day, probably 50 years earlier. They looked happy and hopeful, the way I'd looked in my own wedding photos 2 decades ago. Do you think it's possible to trust again? I asked Donovan as we stood looking at that photograph. After something like this, do you think someone my age could ever believe in love again? I think trust is like physical therapy, he replied thoughtfully. It takes time, it takes effort, and it probably hurts sometimes. But I also think you're stronger than you know, And I don't think what Quincy and Sarah did to you defines what's possible for the rest of your life. 3 months later, I was settled into my cottage and had begun the work of establishing the foundation that would become my new purpose. We called it the Margaret Foundation, named after one of Sarah's first victims whose case had particularly moved me. Our mission was to educate older women about the warning signs of predatory relationships and to provide resources for those who found themselves in dangerous situations. Donovan had been right about the financial settlements. Between the insurance money, the restitution from Sarah's conviction, and the sale of the house I'd shared with Quincy, I had more than enough money to fund the foundation's initial operations and to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But more importantly, I had purpose again. Every week brought new stories from women who'd recognized the warning signs in their own relationships thanks to our educational materials. Every month brought successful interventions where potential victims had been warned away from dangerous situations. On a warm evening in late summer, I was sitting in my garden reading case files when Donovan stopped by with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant. This had become our weekly tradition, sharing dinner and talking about our respective work. I got a call today from the prosecutor in Sarah's case. He told me as we sat eating pad thai on my patio. She was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. And Quincy? 8 life sentences. His cooperation with the investigation earned him a slightly lesser sentence, but he'll never see the outside of a prison again. I nodded, feeling a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. For months, part of me had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some new revelation or legal complication that would threaten the peace I'd found. But this felt final. "How does it feel?" Donovan asked, studying my expression. "Like the end of a very long, very dark chapter," I replied, "and like the beginning of something much better." As we finished dinner and watched the sun set over my garden, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. A year ago, I'd been a lonely woman in a loveless marriage, counting down the years until retirement and wondering if this was all life had to offer. Now I was 65 years old, running a foundation that was making a real difference in people's lives, living in a home I loved, and surrounded by a family I'd chosen and who'd chosen me in return. The attempt on my life had been meant to end my story. Instead, it had given me the chance to write a completely new one. And this new story, I realized as I watched Donovan help me clear the dinner dishes with the easy familiarity of true family, was going to be much better than anything I could have imagined. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.